In this lesson, I'm going to look at the various options to actually perform a Windows Server 2012 installation. For example, booting from a CD, using a USB key, installing from a virtual machine template, and even booting over the network. Now, in the old days, you were actually sent a number of CDs for your operating system, or if we go back far enough, a number of floppy disks. Nowadays, it's more likely you actually download your operating system media, and in fact everything else, from the internet. You're probably going to have an ISO file like I have right here. So this actually contains the Windows Server 2012 operating system, both the standard and the data center. Now, your first option typically would be to burn this to a DVD. As I jump over to my client device, I have the same file access. So you could use a third-party piece of software to write an ISO file to media, or providing you have a writable DVD drive, you can just right-click on the file and say Burn Disk Image. So this is automatically going to just perform that creation of the media for you. You would then insert that CD or DVD into your physical server and then ensure the BIOS was configured to boot from the CD first, or generally there is a key press you can perform to select a temporary boot device. You would boot from the media and then perform the installation. The disadvantages of ISO though is typically it's fairly slow. If you compare that to something like booting from a USB device, a DVD is much slower. Also, more and more servers today would not even have a DVD drive. It's difficult to update a DVD with updates. It's very much a write once media, and it doesn't really support any kind of synchronicity. I can't deploy obviously 10 servers at a time from a single disk. If I focus on the speed problem, our next option would actually be to create a USB drive with the content of the ISO file. Now you can do this manually. I'm actually going to show you the steps in a second for another purpose. But Microsoft actually has a great tool you can just download, which takes an ISO and creates a USB from it. The easiest way to find the tool is if I go to Bing and I just type Microsoft Store USB ISO tool. Then you can see this Windows 7 USB DVD download tool. If I go there, it gives you the instructions, you download the tool, and once downloaded, you'll actually have this interface. So this is the tool. You select the ISO file you wish to burn to USB, or copy to USB, the correct terminology today. You then say, do I want to write this to a DVD drive or a USB device? If I select USB device, I can select the device I wish to use, and then just click Begin Copying. So it will format that USB drive, it will wipe all the content away, but I'll now have a bootable USB drive containing the Windows Server 2012. And don't let the fact that the tool is called Windows 7 stop you. This works great with Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8 as well. Now, the advantage of the USB is pretty much all servers would still have a USB port, even if they don't have a DVD drive, which makes it useful to use. Because it's USB, I can potentially update that multiple times without really wasting the media. It's going to be faster than an ISO file. And also, let's say you're using a sysprep, or you just want an auto answer capability. Well, I can copy that to the file and then remove it and then replace it with an updated one. Very easy. The disadvantage is I'm still doing this manually. I can still only use this USB stick on one machine at a time. If I actually now think beyond physical machines, let's take the virtual scenario for a second. Well, remember that ISO file I had? I can actually attach this directly to a virtual machine. So in a virtualization environment scenario, I can actually create a new VM, and in the settings, I can actually say for my DVD drive, map to that ISO file. And that would actually boot the VM directly off of the ISO. So that's a great way to use the ISO files directly. And the reason you'd want to keep the ISO file in a central library. I maintain a central library of all my software installations, my operating systems, for exactly this type of purpose. If we now think of physical and virtual and more flexibility, the next option would be to create like a network share. Copy all the installation media onto that network share, create a small bootable device, and then copy the installation files, such as the WIM, onto your local machine. If you want to install over the network, Windows Server 2012 has the Windows Deployment Services. Windows Deployment Services allow operating systems to actually be served up over a network service, so other machines can then boot over the network. In a similar fashion to obtaining an IP address, an operating system can essentially call out over the network, I need an operating system please. The Windows Deployment Server would see this request and offer it an operating system. and then send the operating system over the network. One of the great benefits of Windows Deployment Services is I can easily take that WIM file and send it over the network. Multicast is also supported. This means that single stream of bits going over the network could actually be read by multiple machines at the same time, enabling me to maybe deploy 20 servers while only sending the bits over the network once. Building on top of Windows Deployment Services, we really have Configuration Manager. So Configuration Manager is part of System Center 2012. This actually leverages Windows Deployment Services. So Windows Deployment Services is running in the background to provide those network boot services to allow a machine to boot over the network and get the operating system. But it really extends that functionality. I can have operating system images, for example Windows Server 2008 R2, then I create a task sequence. And this task sequence can be very, very powerful. A task sequence, for example, can partition the drive, enable BitLocker or disable BitLocker, apply the Windows operating system, configure the network, join to an Active Directory, apply device drivers, perform BitLocker steps, install latest updates based on the Configuration Manager content. So it really helps in the deployment of the complete operating system. Now, both of the Windows Deployment Services and System Center Configuration Manager deployment services, because it's using WDS underneath, for a physical server, that will likely just work. Again, you may need to set the BIOS to boot from network or select a temporary boot device, but most network cards in a server will enable boot over the network. If you wish to do this for a virtual machine, by default this will not work. If I look at a typical virtual machine, for example on Hyper-V, it has a network adapter. This is a synthetic network adapter using a special type of driver. If I would like this VM to be able to boot over the network, you would have to add a legacy network adapter. This emulates an Intel NIC and will enable boot over the network. The good news is this is actually set automatically for you. If you create a new virtual machine in Hyper-V and you actually tell it, I want to install over the network, by default it will use a legacy network adapter instead of the synthetic network adapter. The final option, which is for virtual machines only, is previously I talked about the sysprep process, which enables me to take a VHD file, boot a VM, and then run sysprep to remove all that unique information. Well, once I have that VHD file, once it's been sysprepped, what I can do is store it, for example, into my Virtual Machine Manager library. So if I look in my library, I have a number of VHDs. My Windows Server 2012 VHD contains a Windows Server 2012 deployment that's been patched with the latest updates, sysprepped, and then shut down. I then read that into my library, and then I go and create a number of virtual machine templates which can all use the same VHD file but have slightly different configurations. For example, a different number of CPUs, different amount of memory. So I can really customize how I deploy this. I can do different OS configurations, different naming, time zones, roles and features to install. So in a virtual environment, you would very much want to take advantage of virtual machine templates, really over any other type of deployment. This should be your preferred approach. For physical servers, you may use USB boot, or again, for the most automated process, look at using something like Configuration Manager or Windows Deployment Services. And again, we want to minimize the manual steps. So we're really going to think about using answer files, which VMM is actually generating for us automatically. When I set my options to deploy a VM, it's creating an answer file and sending it temporarily to the new operating system it's creating. So that was a quick overview of the main ways you could think about deploying an operating system.